The world is becoming increasingly complex and volatile. How can we make sense of it all?
I'm Richard Engel.
And I'm Yalda Hakim.
And we're the top international correspondents at NBC News and Sky News. And we present Sky News' latest podcast, The World. Each week, we'll cut through the noise to guide you through the week's global events and explain to you why what happens out there matters to you wherever you are.
Listen now to The World with Richard Engel and me, Yalda Hakim, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, good morning, and welcome to Politics with Sam and Anne, the podcast that gives you everything you need about the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes. And it's all change overnight because of America and Donald Trump again.
It's Tuesday, March the 4th. My name's Anne McElvoy from Politico with Sam Coates from Sky News. And yes, the papers are out of date already after a decision yesterday evening by Donald Trump to pull all military support from Ukraine. Every calculation about how to handle the global political situation is being redone at pace in Downing Street and elsewhere in European capitals.
Just as you thought that Keir Starmer had a plan that might work, just as he was basking in the plaudits from just about everybody in the Commons, apart from Emily Thornberry. Hello, Emily. I know she's usually a listener. The White House has pulled the plug. So that's our headline discussion for this morning's podcast.
But there's also a second risk for Keir Starmer here too, with all this distraction, that he takes his foot off the pedal of the domestic agenda. In only 3 weeks, it's the spring statement where the government's economic policy is given the once-over and we find out if they're on course to hit or miss those borrowing targets and whether they need to take corrective action. In 3 months, it's a once-in-a-political-generation mega spending review determining everything the government will be able to do over that period. So the PM can't afford to ignore what's going on at home, and neither, Sam, will we.
We're going to pick up the subject of growth pretty much in the second half of this podcast, or maybe slightly more than half of this podcast, with a story that we're launching on Sky News this morning. But because it's Tuesday morning, I've got the weekly YouGov Sky Times polling voting intention. There's been another crossover, and it's good news for Keir Starmer. Labour is back in front. It's edged ahead of Reform UK once more. Now, all the moves I'm about to tell you are within the margin of error, so I wouldn't lose your mind, but it won't stop a smile amongst most Labour MPs. So the numbers are as follows. Labour on 26, so that's up 2. Reform UK on 25. They haven't actually changed since last week, but that's jumped by Labour has allowed them to overtake Reform. Conservatives on 21, down 1. Lib Dems on 14, down 2. And the Greens on 9, plus 1. Fundamentally, the picture is the same on voting intention that's been all year, which is a three-way split between the front runners. And that hasn't changed. Anyway, right, let's get on with the main business of this podcast. A little after 9 o'clock last night, I started to get WhatsApps from someone inside government saying that they'd feared that the US had pulled all support from Ukraine. And then it started to seep out in midnight, as far as I could tell, in the US, around midnight our time, sort of 5, 6 o'clock American time, with Fox News reporting that there'll be a pause and it will go on until the president believes that President Zelensky has shown a good faith commitment to peace. Now, a Trump administration official is telling anyone who'll listen that this is not a permanent termination of aid, but it is a massive, massive deal. And do you want to pick up where we go from there?
Well, yes, it does appear that defense officials now saying in the US that military equipment not already in Ukraine, including weapons currently in transit, won't even be sent to the front lines. Reuters reporting that Trump is simultaneously moving forward with plans to drop economic sanctions on Russia before a peace deal is even struck. So that's a huge pincer movement coming there from the White House, from Donald Trump on Ukraine. And he made clear on Monday that the minerals deal Volodymyr Zelensky wanted to sign in Washington remains on the table. Looks like a bit of a forcing maneuver, Sam.
And this is, to be absolutely clear, this is the kind of weaponry that was being expedited at the back end of the Biden presidency. So some of the weaponry that they were trying to shovel out there in case Donald Trump did something like this is actually never going to make it to that Ukrainian front line. And I suppose there's a bit of an irony, Anne. The US is doing this because President Zelensky wasn't dancing to their tune. But just as, the news of this pause was breaking, it appeared that Zelensky was starting to shift a bit. So if you remember, the story of yesterday was that Zelensky said that peace was a long, long, long way away overnight, Sunday into Monday, that he enraged Donald Trump and he denounced him on Truth Social. And so Zelensky moved last night and he said, and he recorded a video, a social media video, suggesting that he did want peace sooner rather than later. So Zelensky recorded a social media video in which he said he wanted to create conditions for proper diplomacy for the soonest possible end to this war with a decent peace. So that is a big shift, much closer to the language being used by Donald Trump than we've ever heard from him before. And he was saying things like Ukraine and Europe and America together can ensure decades of peace. So much of Donald Trump's language and way of talking about this is a desire for peace so that young men stop dying on the battlefield. Zelensky moved his language a lot closer, but it was too late.
And that's not the only bad news for Ukraine overnight. At the Lancaster House Summit, you'll remember Ursula von der Leyen at the beginning of the week making that big play of an increase in defence spending. But the other big item on Thursday's agenda for the European Council Summit, a huge new infusion of aid for Ukraine, is now also in doubt. Politico's Brussels Playbook reporting there that Hungarian Viktor Orban is getting the blame for putting a 20 billion euro defence surge to Kyiv on ice. Now, Budapest is always a bit of a complex one when it comes to this sort of thing. It might be more on board with the broader defence ramp up in Europe, but Orban has made clear that he's dead against the Ukraine package as such. And that means that any explicit reference to fresh delivery of military funding gets cut from the council conclusions, at least those circulating ahead of Thursday. That's a really difficult one, Sam, for other European leaders to cut through, since Hungary is an EU member.
So I suppose where we end up starting Tuesday is with President Zelensky as far away as it's possible to be from President Trump, much further away than he was after the weekend of diplomacy by Keir Starmer. It looks like Europe is more disunited today ahead of its big council meeting on Thursday than it was at the weekend when many of those EU leaders gathered in Lancaster House with Keir Starmer. And we have the prospect of Russia being handed a real and present opportunity to potentially even make advances and certainly repel more easily Ukrainian troops. I'm afraid I'm simply not enough of a military analyst to know how quickly the impact will be felt on the Ukrainian front line of the decisions being made by the White House last night. But it's a military problem. It's a diplomatic near disaster. And do you want to just give us a little bit of analysis of where you think the big picture is right now?
Yeah, sure, Sam. Well, I mean, picking up on that, it's very good news for Russian generals, isn't it? And we don't know exactly what they'll do, but we have seen a ramping up of attacks on infrastructure in Ukraine. And that means whether it's energy, any sort of supplies and infrastructure that Russia can get to by heavy bombardments or drone attacks. It's not that Ukraine can't fight back, but if it does that, it's moved its focus, its materiel to combating that, and that maybe allows for other movements, other Russian troop movements and consolidations, or even going further by Russia on its territory. And of course, the feeling which will be, I think, very, very much felt very deeply in the Ukrainian population is that they are now left alone by their major ally, the US, while that is going on. So that's the nutshell, perhaps, of the military situation. And it doesn't look like Donald Trump would, if that were to happen, it sounds more like he's more likely to blame Ukraine for not making peace than to blame Russia for pushing forward. So we've really seen that switch in the way that he talks about the two countries compared certainly to the last administration. What do we think it means here then, Sam? I mean, what's one thing I'm picking up is I think Keir Starmer, for all his confidence, there will be a bit of a worry. There will be a pushback from people saying, like, how much further does Britain really want to get embroiled in what's clearly fast-moving and difficult and dangerous situation? I noticed that Angela Rayner, as the Deputy Prime Minister, but with a very direct connection to the party, very direct communication style, different from Keir's sort of more lean back style is out and about on the media rounds this morning. I make of that they would like to consolidate a sense that the entire cabinet, no matter which wing they come from or any previous differences, is right behind this, and that Labour as a movement should get behind it, as well as Keir Starmer speaking for the UK.
There was probably an impulse to get Angela Rayner out this morning. Rachel Reeves is out at lunchtime. Get people who are not just focused on what's going on in Ukraine, both backing Keir Starmer and showing that this government isn't just about what's going on overseas. But it's all been complicated by what happens overnight. I suppose the number one challenge for Keir Starmer is that his effective claim at the weekend to have that fibre optic cable to the White House, to have built up credit with President Trump in the state visit last Thursday, and as a consequence to be able to have not only a direct line to Donald Trump, but also some influence over Donald Trump. Well, to be honest, that looks ever so slightly less of the case this morning. What Keir Starmer hasn't managed to do was hold off direct action. Instead, what appears to have happened, as far as I can see, is that there were tensions in the White House over Zelensky's comments into Monday morning about peace being a long way off, and then he gathered, in sort of lunchtime lunchtime US time, sort of early evening UK time, he gathered a sort of kitchen cabinet of hardliners for a meeting about Ukraine that have ended up pushing him into this place. And it just shows the relative importance of different voices in President Trump's ear, and Keir Starmer just slightly lower down the list than he would want. If you compare it to something like Tony Blair and George Bush, would George Bush have taken the UK Prime Minister's pleading of the day a little bit more seriously than Donald Trump has taken Keir Starmer's? That's an imponderable. We don't quite know. But Keir Starmer certainly wouldn't have wanted to see what we're seeing at the moment. Diplomacy is always about hope, though. And the plan yesterday, I think, remains the plan today. And there's one very clear thing that, talking to sources, is evident, and that is that the route out of this is for President Zelensky to sign the deal on minerals. That was always going to happen before there was a ceasefire, but the minerals deal is of paramount importance.
Absolutely. I think it's become about that. And also, frankly, it's going to kick in way beyond the Trump administration. So I think that may be also weighing, and I'm going to be exploring that later this week on another podcast. It's like, actually, is it in Ukraine's interest, however bad this deal looks as a business proposition, to just get this done? But, we must then hope that something follows in terms of support, which, as you point out, Sam, what's happened overnight doesn't suggest that this is just a bit of a tweak about a deal. It suggests something more fundamental. I would look at it also, I think that perhaps we were a bit hard, including maybe myself, on Peter Mandelson's intervention, who seemed to be pushing hard at India when he said unequivocally we need Ukraine, or Ukraine needs to look like it wants to do a deal. And people said, that's not what Keir Starmer said exactly. But in fact, I think what's happened now, you could say Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, the ambassador to the US for Britain, I think he may have anticipated what has happened, that if this deal didn't go ahead in some form, and the White House didn't get the message it wanted from Zelensky, we will do this peace deal pretty much at whatever cost, that things could get worse. So I do think, looking at the events of the last 12 hours or so, I'd possibly circle back and think he maybe had a point. I
do wonder whether there wasn't a lot of fascinating politics behind Lord Mandelson's ABC American TV interview on Sunday morning. After he made those comments about Ukraine maybe embracing an immediate ceasefire, government ministers came out very firmly and said it's not government policy. But they did not, Anne, say that the comments were unwelcome or unknown to Downing Street, right? And I do just wonder whether or not there wasn't method in what was definitely not madness in the cold light of this morning. So that is, I think, a guide to listening far more closely to Lord Mandelson, who I think was, meeting the Ukrainian ambassador, talking to the Ukrainian ambassador in the US Monday, like, the guy is working the politics on the US end. Let's be very clear about that. And his audience isn't the UK and isn't really isn't us, but it does seep across. And that's occasionally a little bit inconvenient for Keir Starmer, but there's a job of messaging to be done that's slightly different from the job of messaging to be done here.
But we must deploy our forces also on the domestic front. And Sam, I think you've had something big going on.
That's right. This podcast does lots of different things. It tells you about the day ahead in British politics, and it flags what matters. Also, Anne, and I'm going to be completely shameless about this, sometimes it's just an advert. It's an advert for work elsewhere. And today we're rolling out something I've been working on for some time. It's all about growth. Well, British politics was all about growth until about 4 weeks ago. The events of the last fortnight seem to have shifted the focus dramatically. Downing Street have embraced that shifted focus. But unless it keeps a beady eye on the details of how it's going to get growth, it will end up being back in the mud in a few months' time if growth doesn't start to emerge. Now, the government itself, Angela Rayner, is out and about. She's got a housing announcement this morning. And in fact, I'll be talking to her, interviewing her in a little bit on behalf of all the TV companies for a pool interview. But also we're rolling out on Sky, quite a big project that I've been working on for some time, about one of the big blockers of growth. And basically what I just want to tell you to do, and is to go and watch it. It's a 7-minute film. Hopefully it'll run plenty of times through the day on Sky.
I love that Sam Coates tells me exactly what I should watch and when, but that probably means you should watch it as well.
If you don't watch it, Anne, I'm going to send it to you and force you to watch it and then ask you questions in the morning.
I know. He literally is. He is actually capable of coming round and putting it in front of me.
Okay, let me tell you what it's about. It might surprise you to know that lots of the biggest infrastructure projects in this country end up being tied up in the courts at a cost of hundreds of millions of pounds to the developers for court cases that are brought by pretty much anybody, which they can do because the taxpayer picks up the bill when these individuals lose. Now, this is all about a absolutely obscure international convention, piece of international law known as the Aarhus Convention, which means that you can challenge any project, any business, any government project on environmental grounds, and your costs are capped at virtually nothing when it comes to court cases, at £5,000 for an individual, £10,000 for an organisation. And it means that we followed the story of a Norfolk retired computer scientist. He's an ex-Green councillor, somebody that the Prime Minister has written about, really doesn't like, who is challenging this country, the world's first carbon capture and storage project attached to the new gas-fired power station in Teesside. And he has tied up this project in knots. He says it'll break the government's carbon budget, means ministers are going to break their green promises, and it needs to be challenged in the court under the laws that ministers themselves have set. But we visited Teesside. There is a huge site there where a gas-fired power station is meant to be being built. Nothing is happening because this one individual can rely on the taxpayer to fund challenge after challenge, and it's in the Court of Appeal. It's in the Court of Appeal today as it happens. Downing Street has got its beady eye on this international convention. It's not quite clear that it can completely scrap it. It's international law, but it's absolutely raising blood pressure in Parliament. 80 projects a year are being taxpayer funded, taxpayer supported, tying up different growth projects. Environmentalists say, look, we need this law, we need this international law so that anyone can challenge companies or governments that are doing bad things, that are breaking, when ministers challenge their green promises. Not everybody has deep pockets, but the government say this is inhibiting growth. It's quite a peculiar situation that we've uncovered. But the Aarhus Convention, which very few people know about, are the reason that projects aren't being built for a long time.
That sounds extraordinary, and also a great reminder of the way that the weeds of these things get in the way, don't they, of those big confident growth plans that we often talk about here, Sam, on the podcast and elsewhere. And it does allow me to make my one pun about this, which is Aarhus in the middle of our street. Or not.
It also just reminds us that, as you say, you can make the biggest, boldest promises on growth, but incredibly technical details that hurt your head to understand need to be tackled head on with force if you're actually going to get it. Good luck, Keir Starmer, in delivering what you say you want. It is not easy. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and we'll be back in 24 hours' time. Who knows where we'll be then, but I look forward to it.
See you then. Bye.
The world is becoming increasingly complex and volatile. How can we make sense of it all?
I'm Richard Engel,
And I'm Yalda Hakim.
and we're the top international correspondents at NBC News and Sky News, and we present Sky News' latest podcast, The World. Each week, we'll cut through the noise to guide you through the week's global events and explain to you why what happens out there matters to you wherever you are.
Listen now to The World with Richard Engel and me, Yalda Hakim, wherever you get your podcasts.